to FutureBets web series. This is the fourth webinar of our series after Dr. K.U. Jin from Beijing, Robert Walcott from Chicago, and Dr. Anant Nageswaran from Singapore. Today we have two speakers from the United States. And for our next webinar, check out www.makefuturebets.com. But before we start, protocol dictates I introduce our group and myself to you. I sincerely apologize to all our repeat listeners. I'm sure this is etched in your memories by now. Very quickly then, Ashika Group is a 25-year-old diversified financial services group offering services such as brokerage, lending, investment banking, wealth management, and asset management. Our team of 300 plus work together to provide services to over 125,000 retail clients, 100 plus institutional clients, and 100 plus family offices. And I, Ishita Jain, will be your moderator for the evening. I'm part of the Institutional Equities team at Ashika Stock Broking, where we write proprietary research for unique stock ideas and service some of the top public market funds of the country. I hold a master's in biotech enterprise from Johns Hopkins and a biochemistry degree. Before Ashika, I had a brief stint at a healthcare-focused investment bank on Wall Street. Let's begin today's webinar on the next frontier of the public health system. And for our first speaker for the evening, we have Dr. Akash Goel, live from New York. Dr. Akash is a physician and a public health expert with a background in nutrition, food, the built system, and human rights. Akash is frequently published in peer-reviewed journals, and his work has appeared on networks and publications such as CNN, New York Times, Time Magazine, Financial Times, and BBC. Akash is a recipient of 2 Cannes Lions and was recognized by the United Nations for his work in human rights advocacy. Currently, he's an assistant professor of medicine at Weill Cornell, New York Presbyterian Hospital. All of us at Ashika welcome you, Dr. Akash, and thank you for giving us your time. The format would be Akash would speak for about 20 or so minutes, and that would be followed by Q&A moderated by me. Over to you, Akash.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thanks so much to Ashika for putting this on, to Ishita, Shirag, Nihal, and Raghava, and everybody for inviting me. And I just want to make sure that everybody can hear me okay. I'll wait to get the green light here from the chat room just to make sure you can all hear me.
It's good, Akash.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So I thought I'd first start by kind of introducing myself and my background a little bit more. And then I'd like to talk a little bit about the food system and how we've kind of set ourselves up for a unsustainable system, which is a driver of both poor human health and poor planetary health, and how this is kind of connected to our current predicament regarding the pandemic crisis. So my background is as a physician. I'm a gastroenterologist, and I focus on nutrition and digestive health. I also focus on public health and policy. And as Ishita mentioned, I'm very interested in both health in the built environment and as well as the future of food. My background starts actually, I'm first generation American. My family is actually originally from India. My mother is from Chandigarh, and my father's from rural Punjab, and he grew up as a sugarcane and soybean farmer. And, growing up, when I would visit India, I realized many things about public health as it relates to kind of last mile communities in low and middle income countries. And that was basically that there were significant bottlenecks in distribution in public health. So, growing up, there were really significant rates of under 5 child mortality, up to the rates of 10%. And most of these deaths were preventable. So, you couldn't find essential medications, things like antibiotics, oral rehydration salts, vitamin A, zinc, vaccines. But in last mile communities, there was deeply penetration for things like Coca-Cola and cell phones. And so, that always kind of stuck to my mind that the private sector was so developed and penetrated in last mile communities, but we couldn't actually get public goods to last mile communities affecting millions of people at the bottom of the pyramid. So, years later, my family actually moved to the U.S. They immigrated in the mid 70s. And originally came to New York and then eventually settled in rural Illinois, which is basically in the middle of the country. And I grew up largely around cornfields in kind of farm country in America. And the thing that, sort of was interesting for me to experience and realize growing up was that, while I grew up across landscapes of cornfields, less than 10% of that ends up making it to the human kind of supply chain for food. So basically, 45% of it goes to livestock feed, about 35% goes to biofuels, and about 15% goes to manufacturing, mostly for high fructose corn syrup, and really less than 10% of it goes to food. So, I always was kind of interested in how, kind of coming from a history of farming in India and then growing up around farming in the US, how, the food system is somewhat broken. And that sort of led me to my field of gastroenterology and, how I've been very interested in kind of food and nutrition policy. And, we're starting to develop a thesis around food as kind of being the unifying factor between both human and planetary health. So what I mean by that is that, we've long known that food is the number one driver of death and disease in the world. It's really accountable for a majority of morbidity and mortality related to diet-related chronic disease. Just globally speaking, there are about 2 billion people that are overweight or obese, and there's also about 2 billion people, if you incorporate micronutrient deficiencies, that are malnourished and undernourished. So you have this huge kind of double burden of malnutrition and diet-related chronic disease. And then that's kind of on the health side, and then on the planetary health side, you see that. Now we're a part of this geologic epoch that's known as the Anthropocene, and what that means is that human activity is the largest driver, constitutes the largest driver of environmental change, and of that human activity, the food sector is really the number one driver of environmental change. So not only if you think about greenhouse gas emissions, but if you look at loss of biodiversity, if you look at land use change, if you look at fresh water use, if you look at nitrogen and phosphorus input from fertilizer. And so, we see that the food sector is something that's kind of a unifying sector between both human and planetary health. And so why is this important? And I think it's important for a number of reasons. And also I want to tie this to, our current day, because everyone's thinking about, COVID-19 and the pandemic. So why this is important is because we have these global accords, things like the Sustainable Development Goals, things like the Paris Climate Accord. And just to review, in the Sustainable Development Goals, the goals around food and nutrition are to really eliminate all hunger and malnutrition, by 2030. And the Paris Climate Accord is, to limit average global temperatures to, less than 2 degrees, aiming for 1.5, by 2100, and transitioning to a carbon-free economy by 2050. Well, even if we do all of these things and we become a carbon-free economy by 2050, we still have to address the food sector because, the food sector comes on top of that, right? The food sector releases, things like methane and nitrogen into the atmosphere, mostly from fertilizer and also ruminant livestock and things like that. And so if we're really not addressing the food sector, then we're going to miss our targets on all of these global accords. And now I want to kind of tie it to what we're experiencing now, and sort of what a thesis is that people maybe not have realized or maybe not be talking about. And one of the most significant environmental issues with respect to food is land clearing and land use change. What we see with things like deforestation is that when there's loss of primary habitat for a number of animal species, that is very environmentally disruptive. And what we feel that that's a significant driver of is habitat disruption, which is thought to be a driver of zoonotic disease. And so what zoonotic disease is essentially viruses that their sort of natural host are in animal species, and they're able to mutate through sort of ecologic disruptions. And so animals and humans that traditionally aren't in close contact, the viruses are able to adapt in those circumstances. So basically over the past 50 years, we've had a significant surge of zoonotic disease. Every few years, there's a new zoonotic disease described. There's been roughly I think 50 some odd zoonotic diseases, and all of these coronaviruses that have been described in recent years, SARS, MERS, and now SARS-CoV-2, which is the virus responsible for COVID-19, are all zoonotic diseases. So my interesting kind of perspective, which I think may not be as highlighted by the news media, which is that our drivers of both human and planetary health are very toxic, and we've had a very disruptive kind of food system, not only for human health but also for planetary health. And we're seeing that that's actually driving environmental change, which I think we're going to realize more and more is a driver of environmental disruption, loss of primary habitat, as well as a driver of zoonotic disease. And so I think that going forward, we really need to adopt more of a what some people refer to as a One Health approach, which kind of combines both human and planetary health. So it's not only about our health, but it's about the health of the planet, and how best can we harness our resources and technology and innovation and ingenuity to both work to serve human health as well as planetary health. So that's kind of a very general introduction. I know Ishita has lots of questions about the details of innovation in public health and across the whole value chain, not just thinking about food and food systems. So I think it may be a good idea for us to kind of go towards the questions, and I think that's kind of a brief introduction of some of my thoughts and some of the things that I've been thinking about, but obviously there's a lot more details, and we can get into that.
Thank you, Akash. That was very helpful. That was excellent. And let's just dive straight into the questions. So I think my first question would be, what changes have you seen from perspectives of a patient, of a physician, and a policy standpoint in public health and care? And how can public health systems be better prepared if something like this hits us again?
Yeah, I mean, so I think that this has been kind of a total watershed moment. I think that most people, we've kind of heard policymakers and things, most of us by now have heard kind of Bill Gates' TED Talk in 2015. And, we sort of thought that pandemics could happen, but I think nobody really thought it would happen. And so, there's lots of things. I mean, our life here and also in India has completely changed. Obviously, everybody is, sort of sheltered in place at home. And so kind of the day-to-day has changed drastically. I think that, we're still just starting to realize like what the significant impact will be on our daily lives, both as patients, but also as physicians and how we practice medicine. Um, so I think from a personal standpoint, I think that, people will start to realize, how fragile we actually are. And I think that, I think from a public and patient standpoint, I think people will just start to prioritize health, in a very, very significant way, much more so than we've ever had in the past. I think physicians, we've been very relaxed on basically protective equipment, and in the past, we would just examine patients a lot of times, without masks and things like that. And I think this is sort of just a real, sort of, drastic change to how we approach, patient care. I think hopefully we'll have, you can probably hear the sirens here in New York. So yeah, sorry about that. So I think physicians, I think our practice is hopefully going to be a little bit more. I hopefully will be a little bit more careful, and I think that from a policy standpoint, I hope that we prioritize prevention, because I think you see the difference between countries that really were successful at containment versus countries that let the cat out of the bag and had to sort of go towards mitigation efforts. And so I think from a health system standpoint, I think that this is a real moment of kind of clarity and reckoning where, we have to come up with better systems for disease surveillance, and really get ahead of things, because, we've never been in a system or in a circumstance with unmitigated disease transmission, with sort of exponential transmission curves that translate to a predictable number of deaths, and so once that happens, obviously now there's a global catastrophe, in U.S. and New York is really the epicenter of that.
Akash, I think your voice has.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. So yeah, no, I mean, basically, I just think that from a health system standpoint, we'll have to, really preference disease surveillance, and I think that some of your questions may get into that, but just to talk about that for a moment, traditionally the way that we've done disease monitoring surveillance in the U.S. is that the CDC has a number of doctors' offices around the country, and they take weekly inventory on chief complaints. So these are patients that come to the doctor's office and say, I have a cough, I have a fever, I have a sore throat. And so they do monitoring, symptom monitoring on a weekly basis at, tens of thousands or maybe hundreds of thousands of doctors' offices, which is an okay way to do disease surveillance. But, we're about 2 weeks behind. By the time they aggregate, collate, and analyze the data, we're about 2 weeks behind an outbreak. And so you see what happens in 2 weeks, when you have exponential curves, you can really miss things. And so, one thing we're thinking a lot more about is, things like digital surveillance. So digital thermometers, smart thermometers that can be rapidly scaled and distributed. There's a company in the US by the name of Kinsa that they have about 1 to 2 million digital thermometers throughout the country. They're trying to scale to about 5 million at minimum to be able to do kind of real-time disease surveillance across the country. But I think more and more we'll find kind of new technologies that are able to, tell us about kind of real-time surveillance much more so than we can do now. And there are some other ways of doing that through kind of Google search queries and things like that, just looking at kind of geolocated search queries of things like fever. But I think the best ones are going to be kind of these new digital thermometer type technologies.
Absolutely. I think the great debate has been around mitigation versus containment, which is where I think these East Asian countries have actually proven to be successful when, in fact, they followed containment and not mitigation. So New York followed the mitigation route and has become now the epicenter of the disease, and with the lack of enough hospital infrastructure. New York houses some of the best medical institutions, not only in the world, not only in the US, but in the world. If New York is facing such a situation, I cannot even imagine what any other city would go through, with in the sense of staff, test kits, hospital beds. Various factors played a role in this adverse situation of the city. What are the lessons learned from New York City, and what should they have done differently?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the problems were structural issues, with the fact that New York City is constrained from a landmass standpoint, much like, Mumbai, we're largely on, one island. And, you have huge amounts of population density. You have lots of people living in close quarters. And then, we're also very social, culture here in New York City. Lots of young people. So what we, I think what happened was that we had several weeks of unmitigated disease transmission, much longer before we started to clamp down. I think that now we have, our politicians, our state governor, and mayor that are fairly aggressive in trying to mitigate the crisis. But early on, there was some hesitation, right? There's been this longstanding debate between, do you keep the economy going, or do you clamp down? And I think what we're learning is that's kind of a false dichotomy, in that there is really no way to keep a functioning economy during a global pandemic, especially when there's very, very high burden. So I think that New York is responding remarkably. We built a number of makeshift hospitals to surge the capacity. We have, called in lots of volunteers, tens of thousands, I think 80 some thousand doctors and nurses have volunteered to come to New York, both from in the state as well as out of the state. They had a naval hospital that was kind of shipped to New York City, that has 1,000 beds, and they've converted convention centers, to have kind of makeshift hospitals. Some of the problems we've had are that a lot of the bottlenecks, as you've identified, have been in a lot of the inputs. So even if we have testing capacity, we may not have the swabs, or we may not have the reagents. We've also had huge issues with protective equipment running out of N95 masks. These are the sort of most stringent levels of mask that are thought to protect from aerosolized, viral particles. And so, we have had to conserve those. And unfortunately, I think early on, we probably did not have enough. And you're seeing that this virus is affecting a lot of healthcare workers, which is a huge issue as well. So, I think that we will learn a lot of things from this. I think a couple of the things, that will come out of this is that, number one, as a country, as well as New York City, we've relied on supply chains that are obviously very, very concentrated and not redundant. And so, when you have supply shocks, with China being down, for several months, 3 months, and then you have huge, supply side demand, you have huge demand. You run into significant issues. So now you have the issue where every country in the world, including all 50 of the United States, are kind of trying to outbid each other, for the same equipment. We also have huge issues with ventilator supply, where we're having to, dip into the strategic national stockpile. We're having to have ventilators sent from other states. And we're also using, the national government has actually implored the private industry through a kind of Defense Production Act to make ventilators. So this is stuff that we haven't done in this country, since World War II. So, it's really something I've never seen in my lifetime, and I can't explain. I think there's so many things that we just didn't plan for. And I think there's lots of things that we're going to do differently after this.
Interesting. When I was in New York, I did feel like it was a very organized chaos sort of a situation. So I'm not surprised how remarkably well they have built up these makeshift hospitals in Central Park and wherever. And great point about redundancy earlier was not incentivized. In our webinar on Tuesday, we did discuss efficiency versus redundancy in case of these supply shocks. So slightly shifting gears in the same format is a major part of public health system is the pharmaceutical industry. And India is the largest supplier of generic medicines to the United States. The pharma manufacturing is an undoubted strength in India with skilled technicians and scientists who can reverse engineer patented drugs to formulate generics and make the drug more affordable. We have skilled labor, manufacturing capabilities. We have a higher quality standard as compared to other countries. Where do you think should the Indian pharma industry focus in the next coming years?
Yeah, so it's interesting that if you look at sort of FDA approvals in the United States for antivirals over the past 50 years, really since the early 1960s, there's only been about 90 antivirals that have been approved. And if you take out the drugs that were approved for HIV, that's more than half of them. So that's about 40 antivirals left. So there's been a significantly kind of slow and few pipeline for antiviral drugs. So I think that on an innovation standpoint, one of the things that pharmaceutical companies that innovate will need to start thinking about is how do we get antivirals through the drug pipeline. I think from a generic standpoint, I think that one of the things that we have to think about is licensing and also surge capacity. If we actually do realize that there is some efficacy behind some of these drugs like hydroxychloroquine and things like that, we have actually supply issues for that. And so, there are a number of people, that have conditions like lupus that take that regularly that are having a hard time getting that medication because of increased demand. The other thing that I'll say is that, one of the things that we're not realizing is that, with high rates of ICU admission, roughly, for folks that get COVID-19, about 20 to 25% require hospital admission. And then about 5%, require ICU admission. And so our ICUs here in New York are full. We've had to surge capacity. In some cases, we have, in one of the hospitals I work at, we have 2 patients to a room. Sometimes we are splitting ventilators to have 1 ventilator for 2 patients. So, and what I mean by how this is relevant to pharma is that if you're in the ICU, most people, it's not insignificant for people to get secondary bacterial infections and things like that. So a lot of these people are on antibiotics and things. And so, we aren't used to having overflowing ICUs for months. And so what is going to happen when, we start to run out of our just standard critical care medications? So these are things like, antibiotics. These are things like our epinephrine, our norepinephrine, our vasopressin, so blood pressure medication, just standard medications that aren't used to significant surges. So I think that, we probably need to do, I think globally, there needs to be a strategic stockpile effort, but also on a per country basis. I think that we need to really be thinking a lot more about bottlenecks, not only in, drugs like antivirals, but also in all of the ancillary drugs that go along with pandemics.
Got it. Coming back to the drugs that you were talking about, I mean, hydroxychloroquine is being used for treating lupus, and some doctors have gone out saying that we have patients who had lupus and were taking HCQ and have come back with coronavirus infection. So there's a big question mark, which brings me to other drugs such as remdesivir that Gilead is working on, and you have Moderna Therapeutics and I think Inovio starting human trials, who started human trials for their vaccine a month ago, and I think there are a few more dozen companies that have gone down this route. Can you talk about these current efforts and endeavors being put in by the pharma/biotech industry in the US?
Yeah, I mean, so you have, I think the way to think about it are that you have kind of drugs that are off the shelf. So these are drugs that are being repurposed from other therapeutic areas that have been shown in vitro to have activity against coronaviruses. So, of those, we have hydroxychloroquine, which is Plaquenil. It's a very old drug that's been used to treat things like lupus. We've also been testing drugs. There was a publication in the New England Journal on Kaletra, which is a antiretroviral that was thought to be a negative study. And you mentioned remdesivir, which was actually a drug that was failed in the treatment of Ebola. So these are kind of all drugs that are off the shelf. In Japan, you have a number of, there's another antiviral that I'm forgetting the name of, and then you also have Camistat, which is a serine protease inhibitor that has been used in acute pancreatitis that has some mechanistic data that looks fairly interesting. So you have these kind of repurposed drugs that are generally antivirals, but also have been shown to be immunomodulators. And then you also have things that are sort of immunosuppressant type drugs. So what we notice is when folks are in the ICUs, they have something called cytokine storm, which is basically when you are in kind of severe septic shock, you have a systemic inflammatory response, and we try to blunt that response. And so there are some drugs that are like monoclonal antibodies to things like IL-6, which are basically they're sort of signaling molecules in this like cytokine storm. And so we're using some of those, on a trial basis in the ICU. The other thing that we're looking into, which has been shown, for many years, is to have benefit are things like convalescent serum. So this is where we harvest the antibodies from folks that have recovered. So we harvest the serum, and then we use that as kind of passive, almost like passive immunotherapy. So we can harvest the antibodies and then use that as treatment. So we are, I believe, we're using that in about 34 states across the country by now, and maybe it's nearly all states, I'm not sure. But that's a trial that's being done out of Johns Hopkins. and a number of partner institutions as well. Stanford, I think Mayo Clinic is a part of that. So that's called convalescent serum. So, those are some of the kind of drugs that we're looking into right now. One of the best resources that I've seen that kind of aggregates the pipeline of drugs and therapeutics is put out by Milken Institute. So I could refer you to that if you probably search sort of COVID-19 therapeutics Milken. You'll see the whole list in terms of where they are in development and what sort of evidence is behind them and who's making them. So that if you're interested in kind of getting an overview, that would also be a good resource.
Absolutely, that would be fantastic to know where everybody is in terms of development. Now, moving on to diagnostic, as we know, individuals who get infected with coronavirus may not show any symptoms for days. Some countries have started testing for these asymptomatic individuals, and some R&D work has initiated around people like you mentioned who have recovered and taken their antibodies. Can you shed some light on the importance of serology tests and asymptomatic testing?
Yeah, I mean, well, ideally we would be in a situation where we could test everybody. I mean, that would be, the sort of dream scenario. Unfortunately, with, kind of rationing of what we have available, we've been forced to test folks here in the US and particularly in New York. And I think it's different based on where you are. But because we have such a significant burden here, we're basically testing people that require hospital admission. And so, it's a little bit different, but in an ideal situation, what we see is that the incubation period is at least 2 weeks. In some circumstances, sorry about that. In some circumstances, it can be actually considerably longer because there is a tail. It's not a normal distribution. And so why we think this has such a significant disease transmission is because we think that there are a lot of young people that are asymptomatic that may be shedding and carrying the virus. And so, I think in the US, and I don't know if it made its way to India, but you see kind of these young folks that, were not staying inside. They were going to parties and things like that across the US. And a lot of people think that that may have been a significant driver. And so, some of the best kind of population-based studies have come out of countries that have had the highest per capita numbers of testing. So if you look at countries, data coming out of countries like Iceland, for instance, they have they have one of the highest per capita testing rates around the world. And what they've noticed is that half of their positives have been asymptomatic. So, we don't know, what our kind of bounds on the confidence intervals are around that. But let's just say that that's within what our expectations are. So if half of the positives are asymptomatic, that's a large number. So ideally, if we were in a situation where we had unlimited testing, we would test, everybody, and that would help to determine, how people should, isolate and quarantine themselves. In terms of serologic, so this testing, when we talk about kind of the rapid-based testing, that this is like a nasal, it's like a nasal and oral pharyngeal swab, and it's a PCR test. So we actually amplify, we look for the actual viral RNA. So that's called a PCR test. So the serologic testing looks for antibodies. So it looks for, basically the immune mediated antibodies that develop as a response to an infection. So there's IgM and IgG. IgM is an acute antibody. IgG is somewhat a delayed antibody that confers, that ideally we would hope would confer immunity, for potentially many years. And so the way that, we think that these serologic tests could be very useful is, if a PCR test is sort of a forward-looking test to say if you have it now and if you'll have it for the next 2 weeks. A serologic test is kind of a rear view window. So it tells you if you had it and, if you have mounted immunity. So the reason why that's helpful is for a number of reasons. Number one is at some point we all have to go back to work and we have to, restart the economy. And so if we're able to identify those folks that have, serology that are positive, then we may be able to give people a sort of certification that they're safe and healthy enough to go back to the world. So for instance, Germany and I think the UK are talking about, an immunity passport. So it's kind of not unlike, having an immunization record. So like for instance, in the US, which I'm sure is very similar to, India, for instance, before you start high school, you have to show your immunizations, right? Or before you go to school. So in the same way, there may be a scenario where if we're able to ramp up these serologic testings, workplaces may say, we want to see your lab work. We want to make sure you're immune before you come back to work. And, we may slowly phase in segments of the workforce that, are thought to be protected. And then once we get to a critical level of herd immunity, roughly 60 or 70% of the population, then we feel comfortable that that's enough of immunologic competence of the population that we're protected against a sort of epidemic.
Got it. Interesting. Before we wrap up, Akash, I have a final question for you that we ask all of our FutureBets speakers. In terms of healthcare trends that you foresee, what is your future bet?
Yeah, I mean, I think it gets back to kind of some of the things that we talked about earlier. And, my real passion and interest is in kind of sustainable food systems. And so I would say that I think that, not only for human health, but also for planetary health, we have to build these kind of mixed integrative farming systems that are very, very resilient. So just in the same way that we're susceptible to plague, our crops are susceptible to pestilence. And so if we don't have built-in resilient systems, then, we're not sort of built, for worst case scenarios. I think that, as I mentioned, diet-related chronic diseases are driving the significant morbidity and mortality, and also leading towards sort of environmental change, which is not only devastating for the planet, but is also leading to scenarios in which, we're in right now. And so I think that we just have to come up with much more sustainable food systems. We have to think about, how to develop more plant-based economies, and also think much more about sustainability. I have significant interests in sustainable aquaculture. This is like fish production, how to do that in a sustainable way. And so, basically very involved in a lot of this work. And I think it's, nice to connect with Ashika's community. And, it's a pleasure for you guys to have me. So I'd love to, continue the conversation and stay in touch. And if I could be helpful in connecting you or anybody from your community with folks doing work in sustainability or innovation here in the US, I'd be happy to.
That's fantastic. That's very nice of you to offer. Thank you, Akash, for your time and your insights. To let our attendees know, Akash has been kind enough to extend his time. So if any of you would like to get in touch with him, would like to talk to him, have some questions, please reach out to your contact at Ashika, and we will set that up. Thank you. Thank you, Akash.
Okay. All right. Thank you.